In the spring of 1977, a small Massachusetts town became the center of one of the strangest creature sightings in American history. Teenagers, days apart, described seeing the same pale, alien-like being, with no mouth, no nose, and a glowing orange eyes. Their sketches, drawn separately, matched almost perfectly. This wasn't a ghost story or a prank. This was something real. And it left Dover forever changed. April 21st, just past 10:30 p.m. A 17-year-old named William Bill Bartlett was driving along Farm Street, a winding road flanked by dense trees and weathered rock walls, the kind of place that seems harmless. Bill wasn't alone. He had two friends in the car with him, but it was he who first noticed the creature. His headlights caught something moving along the low stone wall to his right. At first glance, it looked like a dog, but then it moved, and he realized this wasn't like anything he'd ever seen. It had a massive, bulbous head, the size of a watermelon. Its limbs were thin and long, almost spidery, and it gripped the rocks with fingers that looked like tendrils. Most disturbing of all were the eyes. Orange, glowing. Not like a reflection, not like a shine. They radiated their own light, staring into the car and seemingly right into Bill. He drove on, shocked, confused and shaking. He didn't stop, but what he saw lingered in his mind like a bad dream clawing its way into daylight. Later that night, still shaken, he sat down and drew what he had seen. The sketch was detailed and eerie, an alien-like figure crouched on a wall, with oversized eyes, long limbs, and no visible mouth or nose. What startled even his friends was how sincere Bill was. He insisted on what he saw, and Bill wasn't the type to invent stories. Every time he explained what he saw, his hands would shake with fear. His father, seeing these changes in his son, believed him. Now, if it were just Bill sharing his story, that would be it. Case closed. I wouldn't even bother making a video based on a 17-year-old's testimony that might not be true. But it turns out that it wasn't only Bill who saw that creature. The very next night, in nearly the same area, just a little further down the road, another teenager, John Baxter, 15 years old, was walking home from his girlfriend's house when he noticed something ahead of him on the road. He thought it might be a friend from school, so he called out, but the figure didn't respond. The figure then stopped moving, stood still, looked at John for a few seconds, and then turned and ran into the woods. And for some disturbing, risky reason, John followed, chasing the figure through thick trees and damp soil, even climbing down into a gully. And that's when he saw it again, standing on a rock, hunched like a monkey, its arms hanging low, and its feet gripping the stone. In the moonlight, its head looked oversized and pale, the eyes dark and staring. He stopped. They stared at each other for a long moment, and John backed away slowly, then turned and smartly ran. He later sketched what he saw, and though the angle and pose were different from Bill Bartlett's drawing, the creature was undeniably the same. But that wasn't the only sighting. A day later, on April 23rd, a girl named Abby Brabham was riding with her friend Will Tainter down Springdale Avenue. She looked out the window and saw the creature. The same pale creature, this time standing upright at the edge of the road, glowing eyes fixed on their car as they passed. Abby said it looked like it had no facial features. No mouth, no nose, just those strange, luminescent eyes. She described it as not a human, not a monkey, but something else. She hadn't seen the earlier sketches, neither had John Baxter, and yet all three depictions matched in shape and in scale. 3 separate witnesses, 3 different nights, all within a 2-mile stretch, all consistent, and all in a town that had no history of cryptid sightings. Word spread, of course, as it always does in small towns. The local paper caught wind of the story, and within days, the media picked it up. Some called it a hoax, others believed it was a classic case of teen hysteria. But the drawings were difficult to dismiss. They weren't sensationalized. They didn't feel like the work of pranksters. There was no punchline, no payoff, just honest accounts and eerily matching details. Bill Bartlett's sketch in particular was haunting. The creature's arms were elongated, with fingers that seemed more like cables than bones. Its body was hairless and peach-coloured, thin and sinewy, with legs that bent slightly at odd angles. The eyes, those eyes, seemed alive on the page. You could almost feel them watching you. Bartlett, in later interviews, always held firm on what he saw that night, and just like the rest, he never capitalized on the event. In fact, he seemed reluctant to talk about it at all. When asked years later, he still stood by what he saw, and even admitted he sometimes wished he hadn't seen it. It had followed him through life, not the creature, but the memory, the sketch, the questions that never faded. And then after that week in April, it was gone. No more sightings, no new witnesses. The creature seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. The forest fell silent again. Dover went back to sleep. But the story lingered. It became legend. A name was given to the creature. The doverdemon. Not a demon in the biblical sense, but a name that captured the eeriness, the wrongness of whatever it was. Cryptozoologists started to take notice. Researchers who normally tracked Bigfoot or the Mothman began to file reports on this new, slender anomaly from Massachusetts. And yet, as researchers combed through the area in the months and years that followed, nothing was found. No tracks, no hair, no droppings, no bones. Nothing but those few eyewitness drawings and the uneasy testimony of a handful of teenagers. The years passed, but the doverdemon didn't fade from memory. In fact, the lack of evidence made it more unsettling. The witnesses grew older, but their stories never wavered. And so investigators began to look deeper, not just at the creature, but at the land itself. They found something strange. Dover sits near the edge of an area known locally, and increasingly nationally, as the Bridgewater Triangle. The Bridgewater Triangle is a region of about 200 square miles in southeastern Massachusetts, filled with paranormal history, UFO sightings, mysterious disappearances, cryptid creatures, and so much more. Heck, it even at one time had cult activities that dated back to the 1970s. These cult activities often centered around animal sacrifices and arcane rituals that left behind headless carcasses and symbols etched into the earth. There were also reports of strange lights in the woods that date back hundreds of years. So yeah, the Bridgewater Triangle is very weird. And it turns out that it was within this triangle that the doverdemon appeared and disappeared. Some people believe this wasn't a coincidence because it was within this triangle that the doverdemon showed itself. And unlike Bigfoot or the Mothman, it never wandered. It never moved beyond those few roads in Dover, as if it were tethered, as if its purpose was fixed to one location. They began to wonder if the creature wasn't local at all. Maybe it came from somewhere else entirely. Paranormal researchers speculated that the area itself may have thin boundaries between realities. Vortices, wormholes, places where energy leaks and entities pass through. The idea wasn't new. Cultures across the globe had long spoken of spirit roads and liminal spaces, thresholds where the laws of nature bent, sometimes just for a moment, sometimes just long enough to let something in. Theories began to bloom like mushrooms in a damp cellar. Was it an alien, an interdimensional being that slipped through a tear in the fabric of reality? Like the stories from H.P. Lovecraft. And the reason people thought this way was because there were details that fueled these ideas, like the lack of sound during the sightings, the consistency in the creature's description, despite no known communication between the witnesses, the brief window of appearance of just 3 nights, and then once again, the silence. It moved like something with purpose, or perhaps like something lost. Cryptid researchers began drawing connections to other sightings around the world, not identical creatures, but similar patterns. The Flatwoods monster in West Virginia, seen in the 1950s, shared the same bulbous head and glowing eyes. The Kelly Hopkinsville encounter in Kentucky, the Hopkinsville goblins, small humanoid beings with spindly limbs and large eyes, seen clinging to doorways and peeking through windows. Then there was the Fresno Nightcrawler, a figure caught on surveillance footage. Long legs, no arms, a shape that looked like a pair of walking pants. Absurd, almost comical, but real enough to send chills down spines. This could very well be another weird, cryptid creature. And then there were the eyes. Witnesses described them not as reflecting light, like a raccoon or a cat, but as producing their own glow. That was unusual. Animal eyes don't do that. Alien eyes might. Then came the comparisons. People began matching the Doverdemon's sketch with other known entities. The resemblance to greys, the classic alien form described in abduction stories, was hard to ignore. Oversized head, thin limbs, hairless, no mouth, glowing eyes. But there were differences too. The Doverdemon didn't seem technological. It wasn't inside a ship. It wasn't probing anyone. It was crawling along a rock wall in the middle of the night, staring into cars, standing by the roadside like a lost animal. This is where others started seeing parallels with folklore, asking questions like, what if what we are seeing already exists? Like this one, the image you just saw is what is called the Managishi. The Managishi are part of the Cree, a First Nations group in North America, folklore. They are depicted as small and hairless, with round heads and 6 fingers. According to folklore, they are known for being mischievous, strange, and often playing pranks. One of such pranks is to crawl out of the rocks and capsize the canoes of people canoeing through the rapids, spinning them to their deaths. But here is another important feature about this creature. The Managishi are said to be often found near rivers and rocks, which is where John chased it to. At this point, the resemblance was, at least visually, uncanny. Once again, this is the image of the Managishi. Now look at what Bill and John drew. Can you see the striking resemblance? They match at least 80%, and that's me trying my best to find faults in the images. The stone walls that lined the old roads were another detail that drew attention. They were ancient, in some places older than the town itself. Some believed these walls acted like channels, ley lines, that attracted energy, or amplified it. Heck, the creature was seen climbing one. Perhaps it wasn't running from the headlights, perhaps it was drawn to the wall itself. But despite all these, still, skeptics pressed on. Some believed it was nothing more than a baby moose, confused and wandering too close to the road. Others said it might have been an owl, its face distorted in the darkness, perched on a branch, eyes catching the light just so, and if you've seen videos of baby owls, you would feel a bit disgusted. Others still said it was a hoax, a teenage prank that spiraled out of control. But none of those explanations sat right with the witnesses. Bill Bartlett insisted he knew what a moose looked like, and what he saw was not it. John Baxter wasn't chasing a bird through the woods, and Abby Brabham wasn't imagining a faceless being with glowing eyes. The police looked into it briefly. There was no evidence of a crime, no damage, no injuries, just drawings, words, and fear. And fear alone isn't enough to file a report. And so the files were closed. The years drifted by, but the sketch remained, framed, circulated, and whispered about. In the years that followed, the witnesses grew up. They graduated, found jobs, and moved on. But when asked, sometimes decades later, the details of that week in 1977 hadn't dulled. Time hadn't eroded their stories. They didn't contradict themselves. In fact, the stories seemed sharper, as if burned into their minds with the kind of precision that only fear can etch into the human psyche. Bill Bartlett, the artist and the first to see the creature, would go on to pursue painting. But no matter how many canvases he filled with landscapes or still life, it was always the demon sketch that people asked about. He didn't like to talk about it. In interviews, he appeared thoughtful, even hesitant, as if every word risked summoning something back into his life. He didn't want fame from the sighting. He wanted distance. But it never came. Bartlett's father, a respected member of the community, stood by his son. John Baxter's school records described him as intelligent and stable. Abby Brabham, the least public of the three, had no history of fabrication. None of them had ever sought media attention. If this was a hoax, it was the quietest one in history. That's what made the case so enduring. There was nothing to gain and only something to lose. Other cryptid sightings often came with baggage, blurry photographs, footprints in the mud, strange howls in the night. But the Doverdemon gave none of that. No audio, no physical trace, just a handful of drawings from. The demon didn't behave like a predator. It didn't attack, it didn't speak. It only watched, like a scout, like something taking notes. Now here is where it all gets crazy and strange. So during my research, I clicked on a link, which took me deeper into the rabbit hole, and it turns out that these 3 teenagers were not the only ones to see it. Heck, this sighting has been occurring for a very long time. They were just the ones that made it go viral unwillingly. You see, just like me, a local historian began collecting stories from long before 1977, And in that story, there were accounts of odd lights in the forest near Dover, stories of animals acting strangely. One report from the 1930s described a thing on two legs with skin like wax, seen standing near a stream. The witness had never come forward publicly, but his journal had survived. His children found it after his death. Inside were pages describing a humanoid creature with no mouth, wide-set eyes and limbs too long for its body, exactly like the teenager's description. Then there were the reports of sound, or rather the absence of it. Each sighting was accompanied by a profound silence. No birds, no insects, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Some witnesses recalled feeling watched before seeing anything, and then there were those who came forward with stories that never made the papers. A boy in 1976, a year before the official sightings, claimed he saw a hairless monkey in the woods behind his house. His parents dismissed it as a dream, but the sketch he made years later, when he saw Bartlett's drawing in a magazine, was nearly identical. Another woman who lived near the Dover-Sherborne line said she woke up one night in 1977 to a pair of glowing eyes staring through her bedroom window. She lived on the second floor. She never told anyone outside her family, not until decades later. These sightings weren't just confined to teenagers on back roads. They were more widespread, quieter, hidden, and it just doesn't stop there. As we speak, people are still reporting cases of the doverdemon. In 2018, a group of hikers found odd prints near Noanet Woodlands, three-toed, elongated, as if made by a narrow foot with grasping toes. Wildlife experts dismissed them as distortions caused by melting snow, but the shape didn't match any known animal. One post from 2021 described seeing a naked figure crouched in the brush near Channing Pond. The witness smartly didn't stop to investigate. She kept walking, but she remembered the feeling, like something ancient was watching from behind the veil of trees. Another account, posted anonymously, told of a child who woke up crying, claiming that the pale man with fire eyes was in the closet. The parents dismissed it as a nightmare until they found scratches on the inside of the closet door. Even today, online forums still light up with stories from Dover. Most are unverified. Some are clearly hoaxes. But a few feel different and follow the same pattern shared by the teenagers. The tone, the detail, the silence that follows. So it turns out that these teenagers were actually saying the truth. They saw something that has been disturbing the people of Dover for a long, long time. And clearly it still does. So does the doverdemon exist? Well, the answer is a bit tricky. You see, biologists, zoologists and naturalists have all weighed in on this story. If there had been a creature with such a distinct physical profile, large-headed, hairless, humanoid, someone would have found scat, bones, a body, or at least reliable trail cam footage. Plus, it doesn't help that the region is filled with deer, raccoons and coyotes, all of which could appear distorted under low light or through the lens of fear. One theory stood out above the rest, that the doverdemon was an escaped exotic animal, possibly a primate, a juvenile gibbon or lemur. These animals, when shaved or suffering from mange, could look bizarrely alien. Their limb-to-torso ratio, their eye shine, their erratic movements, all could match descriptions of the demon. But this theory had problems. No local zoos reported a missing primate. No private owners came forward, and no prints, fur or claw marks were ever found. Others speculated it could have been a misidentified fawn. Deer are common in Dover. A young fawn, separated from its mother, could appear awkward and alien-like, especially if seen from the front, where its eyes seem far apart and the snout blends into its skull under headlights. But even you can see the difference and how the skeptic's opinion doesn't match. Some skeptics even argued that Bartlett's art background made him too good at drawing the demon. I mean, his dad was a good artist, so critics suggested he might have created it as a personal myth, which then infected others around him. Mass suggestion, a living meme before the internet ever existed. But if it was a hoax, it was one with no payoff, no fame, no follow-up. The kids didn't cash in, didn't write books, didn't go on talk shows. Bartlett avoided publicity for decades. Baxter quietly left the area. Brabham disappeared into privacy. That's not how hoaxes behave. And if it was mass hysteria, it was a strangely isolated case. 3 people. 1 weekend, then silence. There was one final attempt to frame the demon scientifically through the lens of cognitive neuroscience. A 2024 study, published in a fringe academic journal, posited that certain kinds of visual distortions, when paired with environmental stresses, could cause people to see things that weren't there, but in ways that seemed consistent across multiple witnesses. The hypothesis centered on something called pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns, especially faces, where none exist. It's why people see saints in toast or aliens in clouds. The brain prefers a wrong guess over no guess at all. But even that theory fell short. Pareidolia typically explains false positives in abstract images, not in 3-dimensional motion, with consistent anatomical detail. And it doesn't explain the emotional resonance, the way these witnesses described their experience with fear, not of attack, but of dissonance, of having seen something that shouldn't exist, but did. That's a very specific kind of terror. Not survival terror, existential terror. By the end of the documentary, the crew had stopped asking what the doverdemon was. They were asking something quieter. Why does it stay with us? Because in a way, it never left.